Bill Veilette has been Executive Director of Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts since late 2009. The mission there is to improve the conservation efforts of libraries, archives, historical organizations, museums, and other repositories, to provide the highest quality services to institutions without in-house conservation facilities, that's us, or those that seek specialized expertise, that's also us, and to provide leadership in the preservation and conservation fields. Among the Nashua gems that the Nashua Historical Society seeks to stabilize, preserve, and display, some of them have been in fact evaluated by the staff at the Northeast Document Conservation Center. Prior to coming to the center, Bill was Executive Director of the New Hampshire Historical Society in Concord, where he focused on improving preservation of and access to its collections. And also, he focused on strengthening local historical societies. He currently serves as the director of New Hampshire's Land and Community Heritage Investment Program, trustee of the New Hampshire Historical Society, founding member of the Amherst, New Hampshire Heritage Commission, and treasurer of the Amherst, New Hampshire Historical Society. Yes, we booked this busy man a year in advance, and we breathe a collective sigh of relief to find him available. Bill is a fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society and has co-authored 3 books: An Early History of New Concord, New York, Amherst Historical Moments, and Walking Tours at Amherst Village. Bill has a particular interest in helping collections holding institutions develop financial strategies to sustain their online digital content and make the case for their fundamental mission of saving, preserving, and sharing historic and artistic works. This interest is why we are privileged to have him here with us tonight. That, and because he is one nice guy. Welcome, Bill.
Okay. Well, thank you, Joanne. I don't know who told you I'm a nice guy. Probably Bill. Well, thank you for having me here tonight. I really appreciate this. I've actually stood here, I think, before giving a talk, and I know I gave a few words at your rededication of the watering fountain when that was conserved a few years ago. Tonight, Joanne asked me to speak about the three interesting conservation projects that we've done at NEDCC. And so I picked 3. They're all very recent. And the reason why I picked recent ones is because we have good photographs of those projects in process. I wish the center had photographed some other projects over the years. We're 39 years old. We were founded in 1973. But we hadn't. But we've done some very interesting things like Lewis and Clark's journals that they carried with them on their persons when they were exploring the West. We did a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. We did Babe Ruth's scrapbooks, including his original contract with the Boston Red Sox. So it runs the gamut. It's not all, kind of formal official government documents like the Declaration of Independence. It's some kind of fun pop culture things too. NEDCC is the first paper conservation center in the country, and that's all we do. We specialize in conserving things that are made of paper. So it would be everything from bound volumes of newspapers to manuscripts, diaries, maps, works of art on paper, and 3-dimensional objects as long as there's paper on it. And you'll see an example of that in a minute. But after I show you this slideshow, then I'll give you a couple of words on why it's so important to be good stewards of collections and to take care of them. And conservation is an important component of that, of course. So I'll end on that note. The first example is what is referred to as the Wilson Globe, which is owned by the Hopkinton Historical Society, and this particular globe dates back to 1811. And here's a picture of it. It's sitting in a bucket with some felt in it to prop it up. But you can see that it's in pretty rough shape. The globe was made by James Wilson, which is why it's called the Wilson Globe. James Wilson was born in 1763 and he passed away in 1855. And he is known as the first commercially successful globe maker in America. So this is an important globe from that standpoint. And I believe he started making globes in 1810. So this is one of his earliest globes that he made. This particular one was purchased by a man named Ebenezer Learned, who founded the Hopkinton Academy. And Learned ended up using this globe in instruction for the students. He passed away, however, in 1831. The globe was handed down to a descendant, and the descendant immediately brought it up to the attic, and it stayed there for 42 years. And the attic roof leaked over those years. Of course, it was subject to the extreme of the summer heat and the winter cold and humidity. And then finally, it was donated to the Hopkinton Historical Society in 1873. So, and then it went into storage at the Hopkinton Historical Society. It was now in a decent environment. But it didn't make its way to NEDCC to be conserved until 2009. So it took a long time to get there. There was no artifact program, I guess, at the Hopkinton Historical Society. Here's the globe under ultraviolet light. It's just one of the techniques we use to try to understand what's happening with the artifact before we start to decide on a plan for how to treat it. But this globe is made of paper mache. The sphere is made of paper mache. Then it's coated with plaster to make a smooth surface to adhere to the paper strips to. And these paper strips are called gores, G-O-R-E-S. That's in the lingo of globe making. This globe, as you can see, is dirty. It's missing pieces. They're what we call losses. It's cracked and it's also stained. And there's also, you can't see it in this photograph, but there's abrasion from the brass horizon ring. The globe was rubbing against it, and so there was some abrasion there. But the ultraviolet light does a really good job of showing the unevenness of the adhesive that, or rather the varnish that was used to theoretically preserve the globe. So the first step in conservation in this particular treatment is we need to remove these paper gores so that we can treat them. And fortunately, the adhesive that this was used to adhere the gores to the globe was water soluble. So we could steam off the gores, and that's what the conservator is doing there. He's steaming them off. Then, and so here's a picture with the very first gore removed and one of the pole caps removed. And what you can't see here, but was very helpful to us, is the maker of the globe incised lines that showed him where to place the gores. So these incised lines, were helpful to us when we had to put this thing back together, right? And of course, a lot of these came off in pieces because they had, the expansion and contraction of the paper mache and the plaster covered globe was different than the expansion and contraction of the paper gores, as this was up in the attic for 42 years. And so a lot of these papers split. So the way we treated the paper in this case was to first soak them in a pH conditioned water, and the purpose of that was to start to break down the surface coatings so that we could start to brush and delicately remove them. And here's what it would look like after the treatment. So a dramatic difference. And what the conservator is doing in this photo is he is now repairing the tears in the paper and filling holes using what's called Japanese paper, which is a very long, thin but long fibered paper, so it's very strong. So it looks like tissue paper, but if you tugged on it, you could feel it's really strong stuff, and it comes in different thicknesses. And we also decided to use the Japanese paper to bridge these cracks in the sphere, because if we just put the gauze back over the cracks, you'd have that same problem where at the crack, the globe itself, as it slightly expands and contracts, is going to try to split that paper. And so the bridge will just kind of relieve that and spread the tension. And then it's time to put it back together. So we started hewing these gores back on, but instead of using whatever type of animal glue that was causing some of the staining of the paper that was used originally, we use a wheat paste. And so we mix this up in our own labs. It's all pH neutral, and it's concocted in a way that it won't stain or harm the paper. And it's also reversible. So one of the tenets of conservation is the treatments should be reversible. And the final piece that went on after all the gores were attached were the poles, and this is the North Pole, which was the last piece to be put back on. There was also some paper on the stand. We didn't conserve the stand. The client in this case didn't want us to coordinate with an objects conservator to have the stand conserved or restored, which we could have done. They just wanted it to be left alone. But they did want us to conserve the paper ring on the top, which is a zodiac scale. And so we did the same process. We steamed it off and treated it, and then re-adhered it again with wheat starch paste. And then the final step was to size the entire globe with a methyl cellulose mixture, and the purpose of that is to make the paper less absorbent. And then once it's sized, we varnished the globe with a protective varnish that's reversible and non-yellowing. So this isn't the kind of varnish you'd go to the hardware store and buy. And the horizon ring also receives the same varnish treatment. And then there's the before and after. Pretty dramatic difference. So this whole process took 8 months. Now, it's not 8 months working every day, all day on it, because the conservators are multitasking. And probably a lot of that 8 months was kind of going like this, trying to think about what's the next thing I'm going to do here. Because things, you plan your treatment and then you start the treatment, but if it doesn't go the way you want it to go, you stop, regroup, and then figure out where to proceed from there. I don't know that we had any issues like that with this particular one, but it is a long process, conservation, or it can be.
What kind of dollars did that end up being?
I think this was $8,000. Yeah, so not too bad. Now, I can't tell you whether it should have been $16,000. That happens. But we operate according to a code of ethics. The American Institute for Conservation has a code of ethics that our conservators are all subscribed to. And so, we do our best to estimate how long it'll take to do something, and then that becomes, that's how the price is determined. But, if you're halfway, if you've run out of money and you're halfway through the treatment, you just keep going. Because we're a nonprofit, our obligation is to the object. We don't stop doing work just because we made a mistake on the estimate. The next example is circus posters. And the circus posters I'm going to show you are owned by the Shelburne Museum, and these date to 1883. And this is where these circus posters came from. This is a house in Colchester, Vermont, photographed in 1991. And it was, at the time, undergoing some renovations, and obviously they were replacing all the siding. So they take all the siding off and voila, circus posters, right? So they do a little bit of research on this, and it turns out that the last time the siding was replaced on this house was in 1883, when there were 2 competing circuses coming through town. And one circus came through first, the Adam Forepaw Circus, or I'm sorry, the John B. Doris Circus, and put posters up on this building, right? And which was undergoing renovation at that time. And then a few days later, or however many days later, the Adam Forepaw Circus comes up and puts their posters over the John B. Doris Circus posters. It just was coincidental that these 2 circuses were kind of going through New England and crossing paths, right? So the owners of this house in the 1990s, when they were restoring it, called up the Shelburne Museum, asked them if they would like these posters, and Shelburne, of course, said yes. And so the solution was, because they needed to get the siding back on and they couldn't take months to conserve them in situ, was to cut the sheathing boards out with the posters on them and ship them off to Shelburne. So there they sat until 2010, I think we did this project. So it took them 9 years to raise the funds or to conserve these posters, or for it to bubble up to the top of the priority list. But you can see the posters are actually pretty well preserved. It's actually a good thing that they were, siding was nailed over them. Now they were all split at the boards, of course, and there's lots of nail holes in them. And even underneath siding you get dirt, so they were dirty, but they survived. And this is not the kind of thing that normally survives, right? Well, the first step in the conservation treatment here, obviously, is to remove them from the boards. And so we tested everything. We tested the adhesives. They were water soluble, but fortunately the inks on the posters were not water soluble, which makes sense because they're designed to be outside. And we soaked the boards in a water bath to soften the adhesive and remove the sections of the posters. Then the next step was to remove the top layer of posters from the bottom layer of posters. Okay, so this is a picture of that. Now, once we have all these pieces of posters, we can start to treat them in a typical way, which is, in this case, to wash the posters in a filtered pH-balanced water. And the point of doing that is to remove dirts and discoloration and stains, but also to remove the acids, because we're balancing the water to balance off the acid. And we're also trying to get all that old adhesive off of the paper, because the adhesive can stain. And then what you see below and above these pieces of sections of the poster below is what we call reame, which is a non-woven polyester sheeting that water can drain through. So you're just using that to support it so it won't tear in the water. Like if you didn't have that and you just grabbed the paper, it could tear. And then he's just putting a piece of clear polyester on the top. And what he's going to end up doing is flipping that over, removing the reame, and then flipping it over again. And the paper will adhere to that clear piece of polyester just by kind of like capillary action. It's just water that's causing it to stick to it. And what he's doing here is he's positioning the pieces like a puzzle, and he's adhering them to a backing that is basically Japanese paper with wheat starch paste. And the wheat starch paste is mixed a little liquid so that it doesn't dry while he's doing this process, so he can make sure he can position it and exactly match those papers together. So here's a detail of this particular poster, which is an image of Little All Right. That's the name they gave to this performer. Little All Right, the Japanese marvel. So he was a tightrope walker. And that's the entire poster of that particular one.
To fill in the blank spots.
Right. So one of the things we don't do is, well, we might infill if a client wants it, but we don't try to create content. So if we infilled it, we might just kind of tone the paper to match what surrounds it so it's not so jarring. And so the reason why we don't try to recreate content is that would be kind of like creating a fake. So that's one of the ethical issues. And then we never, ever overpaint. So you might in-paint, which is filling a loss, but you wouldn't overpaint an original piece of art or a design or lettering or something like that. Because again, you're making something other than it isn't. So we end up not doing a lot of work for dealers, because dealers like to make things look new, and hopefully they're honest with their clients and tell them what they've done. But if they're not, you could be deceived into thinking you're buying something that's more original and in better condition than it really is. But that is not the ethic of a conservator. A conservator, the goal of conservation is to just stabilize materials so that it will last as long as possible. And if the stains can't go away through that process, you don't do anything aggressive to try to remove those stains that would harm that object and cause it to have a shorter life. And I have an example of that later. So the posters underneath were interesting. Here's a detail shot of one of the 2.5 posters that were underneath the top posters. And this is these are posters from the Doris Circus. And this one is Ella Stokes, who was a famous bareback rider and an acrobat. And you can see her riding bareback there, which is kind of neat. And then here's a little image of her doing something acrobatic. So these are really kind of very lovely, artistic things, these posters. And then here's the other complete poster that was underneath, and this is the advertisement of the John B. Doris Great Interocean Museum, Menagerie, and Circus. So, a heck of a mouthful there. And here's just a shot of the posters in process as we're completing them and putting them against the wall, waiting to be finally trimmed and packaged up. Okay, the next object the final one, is the Paul Revere Letter. This was very exciting when this came to light. This is a letter that dates back to May 2, 1775. Now here's a wonderful portrait of Paul Revere. Paul Revere was a silversmith, which is why he's holding that piece of silver. And we all know that his famous ride, was on April 18, 1775. And he rode from the north of Boston, where he lived, out to warn people that the redcoats were coming. And this is his restored house in the North End. And this house now is owned by the Paul Revere Memorial Association. So the Memorial Association mostly takes care of this house, but I believe they also have some objects of Paul Revere's and some letters. But a lot of Paul Revere's letters are at the Massachusetts Historical Society or other places. This particular letter that came to light is not owned by the Paul Revere Memorial Association. It's owned by a descendant. So this letter, what is this letter? This letter was written 2 weeks after his famous ride. And he wrote it from Charlestown, where he was hiding out, because the British knew he was involved, with this. He was one of the revolutionaries. And he wrote it to his wife, which is why it starts off, "My dear girl," which is not how I would write it to my wife, but... And then it ends with a P.S. to his son, which is why he closes with, "Your loving father," right? So what is he writing to them in this letter? Well, what he's doing is he's writing to them about, he's giving them instructions on how to escape from Boston and to join him in Charlestown. And he's telling them what to bring with them, because he's in need of some linen shirts and socks and things like that, right? And he's asking his son to kind of hang back and, come when he calls him, but he needs his son to hang back for some reason. And so it's a very interesting letter. Well, the letter was transcribed in 1891 and published in a book called The Life of Colonel Paul Revere, written by Elbridge Henry Goss. But since that book's publication over, 100 years ago, people just assume this letter's long lost, and it didn't survive. So the only thing they had was this transcription. But of course it did survive, and what ended up happening was the descendant brought a box of stuff in that theoretically belonged to Paul Revere, and they wanted the Paul Revere Memorial Association to verify the authenticity of these items. And when they opened this letter up, they immediately knew what this letter was, and the executive director turned white and almost fainted and stuff like that. But the letter was in rough shape. This is actually after conservation, and it had been repaired, over the years, and before the techniques have evolved properly to do these things correctly. So it was lined with cloth, but adhesives were used that caused all this staining. It had splits in it along the folds, and it's missing some pieces, but it's all legible. Actually the rag paper is actually pretty solid. So the treatment was very straightforward. This is more of a typical treatment that we do, every day. We tested first the document to make sure the inks were not water soluble, so that we could wash the item, and it turned out we could. Then we humidified it and immersed it in a filtered water / alcohol bath. And the reason why we use alcohol is it helps stabilize this particular type of iron gall ink, so that the ink won't float off the paper. And then we followed that by bathing it in a bath of pure water so that we can get as much of the acidity out as possible and dirt out of it. The bathing also softens the adhesive, which was used to put the cloth backing on. So the conservator's peeling the backing off right here. And there's the piece of cloth that was on the back of the letter. Now, it's actually, in this case, probably not a bad thing that this cloth was on. It did end up staining the letter, but it probably kept the letter together so that no pieces went missing. So, you can't be too critical of what people have done in the past sometimes. But what the cloth did was, because you can't see through it like you can with that Japanese paper, is it obscured who this was addressed to. And it says there, to Mrs. Rachel Revere at Boston. So it's really clear that when he's saying my dear girl, it's his wife. It's not a daughter. I don't even know if he had a daughter, but it's not, a daughter. So this is a photograph of us now repairing a tear along the fold. So wherever a piece of paper is folded, it tends to want to tear. And so they're using a very fine piece of Japanese paper and some wheat starch paste to repair that. And you could see through the Japanese paper. So that's another advantage of it.
Why do you repair on the writing side rather than on the back side?
You would tend to repair on the back side if you can, but sometimes you have to repair on both sides, because the repair won't hold if it's only done on one side. And here's the final result of the letter, with the conservator just simply pointing to the PR for Paul Revere. Now but let me actually, the point I wanted to make on this one that I alluded to earlier is all that staining that you still see there, and it doesn't look so bad in this photo, but you'll see in two photos it looks worse. We probably could have removed that if we used chemical bleaches, but we never do that. We bleach, quote unquote, but only with ultraviolet light. And The reason for that is that if you use chemicals, you can get the chemicals in and make them do their thing, but you can never really get the chemicals fully out. So, if you're like a really intense bleacher with your laundry, and you notice that after a while your t-shirts have holes in them, that's exactly what would happen to your manuscripts if you bleach them. So again, the ethic of a conservator is to stabilize. And if in the treatment process it cleans up and the stains go away and it looks better, that's great. But the goal is not to make it look perfect and new, because that could actually cause harm. Now in this case, we also have a very big service to digitize collections, and that is growing like crazy because everybody wants to put their collections online. And so because the Paul Revere Memorial Association didn't own this letter, they wanted a copy of it. So we did some very high resolution digital photography and created printed facsimiles and whatnot for them. Our approach is a little different than what you can kind of like do at home, so to speak. We do everything on a copy stand with high resolution digital cameras. We use flash photography so that you don't have the document blasted by light. If you ever have scanned a document, it takes a while for that light element to move, especially if you're doing a very high resolution scan. And that's just not good for the documents. So we do flash photography. And it also keeps the heat down in the room. So it's a very, very gentle approach. And here's just another shot of the manuscripts sitting on the copy stand. We also have some little tricks like this. We put the manuscripts on black paper when we photograph them if the inks on the other side are bleeding through. And that has a way of improving the contrast of the side we're photographing so that you don't see that bleed through. So there's all these little tricks that our technical photographers know. So those are the three examples. I hope you found those interesting. So here's my pitch on why it's so important to care for collections. And it's not an opinion I formed since working at at NEDCC. I've been in NEDCC for 3 years. It's an opinion I formed when I was running the New Hampshire Historical Society. And at the New Hampshire Historical Society, we're just kind of like a bigger version of a local historical society, but we're really doing the same things, right? So we have collections, and then we have all these programs, and there's just a lot going on, right? We're publishing things. And as I was looking at our operation up there in Concord, I'm thinking to myself, if I had to kind of figure out of all these things we do that are great, what is it that really defines us the most as a historical society? And so I thought to myself, well, how can I kind of make the contrast really stark? And I came up with this idea that, well, imagine a scenario where somebody wanted to create a competing New Hampshire Historical Society, right, competitor, or in your case, a competing Nashua Historical Society, right? I don't know what they would call it. You've got the name. They could actually do, like immediately, a lot of the things that you do. They could have meetings and invite lecturers, and they can compete on getting better lecturers, right? They could go into the school systems and offer programs to the kids and compete on doing it better. They could publish books, right, and try to do a better job than you at publishing books. So they can do a lot of those things very quickly with not a lot of investment. But the one thing they cannot do is they can't recreate your collections. Because you've been at it since, when were you founded?
1871.
1871. You got a heck of a head start, right? Plus, all these things that you have, a lot of them are unique. There's only one of them, and you got it, right? Now, that confers upon you a tremendous obligation of stewardship. I mean, you need to take care of this stuff. And, or at least that's how I felt, right? So, kind of like your core competency, to be crude about it in business terms, your competitive advantage is your collections. But it's also your biggest moral and ethical obligation to care for these, so that the people who are going to be sitting in these seats 100 years from now can enjoy them, right? So conservation is one component of that. I mean, it's certainly it can be sometimes the most important component if the object is failing on its own and it needs to be stabilized to preserve it. But it could be the third most important thing. You know, maybe the most important thing is to do more research on that object, and so that you can understand what you have and interpret it better. Or to just simply put it in a better environment so that it'll last longer. So that could involve backing up and installing proper climate control systems and shelving, or whatever the issue is. So, but conservation is definitely a component of it. The thing is, it's a very expensive component of it. And you'll see that when you go through the brochure that I was handed earlier. There's some eye-popping prices for some of the work. But that makes it even more important to understand that it's important to care for the objects, so that you don't have to conserve them for the wrong reasons, later. So that's my pitch on collections care. It's not to say I didn't love, our school programs and our lectures and our publications that we did at the New Hampshire Historical Society. I loved it all. But the thing that I lost sleep over was the collections. And I think it was a well-placed, focus at the time. So, well, thank you very much. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer. Yes, sir.
What is your training in terms of the conservation of document stuff? I mean, how did you get to?
So I am not a conservator. Just like when I ran the New Hampshire Historical Society, I was not a scholar. The old formula was to run a historical society, you had to have a PhD and have published and whatnot. But that formula is shifting a little bit. And so my background is I actually ran a region for Otis Elevator Company. So I went from elevators to history. And the one sentence reason is that, or two sentence maybe, is when I moved to New Hampshire, I bought a historic house. And in the process of learning how to rehabilitate that house, I got very involved with historic preservation. And then I just got sucked in. One thing led to another, and then, but I kind of came into it through historic buildings, and then got into history, and then found that the thing I thought was most important was the collections, and then that's how I ended up at NEDCC, because it's just all about collections at NEDCC.
Let me amend the question. Where do conservators learn? What schools are teaching, or how?
There's actually no one answer to that. It's a very interesting field. You could start off as a fine arts major and end up being a conservator, or in paper conservation you could start off as a chemist, and end up being a conservator, because they all have a lot of chemistry background. Or you could just have fallen into it, by coming in, say, through a bookbinding program at North Bennett Street School, and then doing an internship at a place like ours, and then, ending up becoming a conservator. So it's actually one of the challenges in the field is that I've been trying to hire more conservators, and there just are not enough to go around, and Harvard keeps stealing them from us. So our biggest competition isn't other conservation centers, it's the institutions, the cushy, prestigious institutions that like to steal our people. But we're flattered. We're flattered. So
I was wondering about the recent restoration in Spain.
With that well-meaning volunteer painted over Christ. Yeah, turned him into a monkey. Yeah, that wasn't good. Well, we don't do, we do works of art on paper, which are mostly watercolors and whatnot, but we don't do oil paintings. But I read up on that. I haven't seen anything confidential about it, but apparently the conservators thought that because it just recently happened, they might be able to, reverse this somehow. But the issue there is that this isn't a particularly important painting. It's important to that community, but there's a question about whether it's worth the quite substantial sum of money to restore this, for just however many minutes it took this person to do all the damage.
I used to do oils, and when I saw that, it was like, it just cut to the heart.
Yeah,
It's
very disappointing.
Just,
Yeah.
Doesn't that bring, though, to the fore one of the problems that we and all the other institutions face? Dollars to do conservation versus the number of things you may have to conserve.
Yes.
I mean, here we are a fairly prosperous organization, and we still are struggling. The little museums and the little town things, there's a lot of stuff out there that's never going to get conserved.
Well, I think you're a plant in the audience, because that's the whole point of tonight, is that the society needs help, I mean? Yes, you have a nice endowment, I'm aware of that, and I've been pretty, following the Nashua Historical Society through Bill, and I've known Beth for a while. But you still need help, and so yes, I think the first order of business is you have to prioritize, but then you have to appeal to the membership. You can't be shy. You have to say to people, look, this is very important. We're the members now. There were members before us who did this. It's now our obligation, and there'll be members after us. And so what can we do, So.
But even after that, it seems to me that there's going to be a lot of stuff that...
Oh, there's never enough money. I mean, there's more conservation work out there that needs to happen than there ever will be resources for it.
Poor little museums that don't have any
Yeah.
endowments,
Yeah,
that stuff's going to disintegrate over time.
yes, yeah, and it's an alarming thing. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
If you have a lot of things that need to be conserved, and if we came to you and say, okay, we have A, B, C, D, is there like a web database where you can go on and say, well, there's lots of C's, so maybe you want to conserve this later, but there aren't a whole lot of museums that have an A, so maybe you want to put your, your
Yeah.
ducks.
We do that a lot with clients who come with rare books. And with most institutions, this isn't the case, but we also serve private clients. And they don't realize you can just go online and see if there's another rare book out there in better condition. So we just do that. We say, well, look, it's going to cost $10,000 to conserve this book. And we'll get on ABE Books and find a copy for, $2,000. So, our recommendation is you buy that other copy, unless it has some association value. If it's a family Bible or something, then there's money's no object. They just want to get it conserved. So yes, I think institutions are very good at that. Private individuals, it doesn't occur to them necessarily to do that. But one thing we do for institutions is institutions will hire us to come in and look at a discrete part of the collection and help come up with a plan and a prioritized list of what should be done with that collection from a conservation standpoint. And NEDCC, when I was the director in Concord, we had them come in and look at our broadside collection, and they gave us a very nice plan, to say, of your thousands of broadsides, here are the 200 that you have to do something with now, These others, if you get around to it someday, fine. And then the ones in the middle, you're kind of okay, but let's do some things to make sure researchers don't abuse them, So planning is always a good thing. I mean, that's something else where as you evolve, you adopt an artifact program, you might want to say, one of the things we're going to throw in there is hiring a conservator to come in and look at this collection of paintings or whatever and giving us a plan. So we need money for a plan. So that's always a good thing. The plans are great because you can use a plan in your grant application to a foundation. And if you have experts saying you must do this, it really carries a lot of weight. Yeah. So I'm going to cut it off because somebody alluded to debates, and I know there's probably people who are like anxious to figure out who they want to vote for. Or maybe you've all made up your minds, but I don't. But you know, you didn't pick this night. You didn't know there was going to be a debate this night, and so luck of the draw. But I'm here and be happy to answer any questions individually. So thank you.